Welcome, freedom-loving people. This is a restricted handling podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Ryan Fugit, Army veteran, covering gun pilot, former CIA officer. I am joined with a dear friend, longtime CIA officer, senior intelligence service, multi-chief of station in some of the tougher places when it comes to the front lines for U.S. national security, Europe, Eurasia expert, 34 years in the belly of the beast between Army, State Department, and CIA, Glenn Korn.
Hey, Ryan. Nice to see you. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the introduction.
And as we need to say, the opinions shared here are our own, and we are no longer part of the government. This is opinions from two formers.
Although we do pay our taxes. We want to stress that.
That is true. That's true, especially me in California.
We are part of the, no comment. We are part of the dream.
Okay, so we got a lot going
Yes.
on. We're hours away from Trump and Putin meeting the U.S. military installation in Anchorage, Alaska. This could have tremendous significance, and the reason we're talking is what impact is it going to have, and get insights from somebody who knows, like you. So, Glenn, as we kick off, how would you set the stage for what's coming here?
Well, how would I set the stage? Obviously, everybody is watching. This is a kind of high stakes meeting, although it may not be as high stakes as it's kind of being billed, because I understand the president and the White House are saying that this is just an opportunity for the president to hear for himself and engage directly with Vladimir Putin on the issue of ending the war in Ukraine. I think that, from what I'm reading in the media, this is all kind of open source, is that there's not a lot of high expectations that there's going to be a major breakthrough. I think one of the goals of the meeting is to set up another meeting where President Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, will have the opportunity to meet directly with President Trump and President Putin. And one thing I think is reassuring is that the White House has said that there'll be no deal made with the Russians on the future of Ukraine without the Ukrainians at the table. That is very, very important. I think Putin may try to present the impression that that's happening, and I'm sure that they're working very hard to make the Ukrainians think that, but I'm glad the White House said that. And I think it's, I hope that that's what the line that will be supported, and the policy that will be supported during the meeting.
And clearly, this taking place in Alaska is not by mistake. What's the rationale there? There's been press reporting, obviously, that it has something to do with the International Criminal Court. It takes Europe out of play. What are your thoughts on why we're locating this in Alaska?
I think there are a couple of reasons. One, as you mentioned, this reduces the challenges related to the ICC since Putin has been indicted, right? So there are some countries he can't go to, or he can't go to without a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of diplomacy, which probably nobody has the time for right now. That's one. Two, it's proximity. It's kind of a neutral spot, although it's not neutral. I'm very glad that the president is making Putin come to him in U.S. territory in the United States. Three, I personally think, I know a lot of people are critical of the administration for doing this meeting in Alaska, but I think it's important for one reason. It's good for Putin to see that there's territory that was once part of the Russian Empire, which is not part of the Russian Empire today and will never be part of the Russian Empire again. Alaska, as many Americans know, was originally settled by the Russians. It was sold to the United States over 150 years ago in, remember, Seward's Folly. And I forget what we paid for it, but it was not very much.
Was it $7.5 million?
I think it was maybe 7.5 or 15 million, but it was a good deal. And Seward at the time, by the way, was criticized, Seward's Folly. Government, the White House was criticized for making the deal, but it turned out to be a very, very good deal, very good real estate deal. And it was part of the Russian Empire. It is not part of the Russian Empire today. And that is the same for Ukraine and other countries that were once part of the Russian Empire. Putin should see and should understand that there are parts of the world that may have been once part of an empire that are no longer part of an empire. Like the United States was part of the British Empire. We are not part of the British Empire, right? So, that is my opinion. And I think that there's a symbolic piece here that people should focus on.
That's an interesting, I feel like I have not read that one, and it makes a lot of sense. So as we look at what's going on the ground, last Friday was intended to be this ultimatum, change of course, concern for sanctions if things didn't change. Putin's been pushing hard on the front lines in Ukraine over the past week. very likely as a lead up to this to assert a little more territory or dominance on the battlefield.
Well, there have been some developments. There have been some claims by some sources, including Russian sources, that the Russians have gained some or made some maybe strategic breakthroughs on the front line, which I think is inconsistent with the facts. The Russians have sent some small teams into like behind, Ukrainian lines in certain parts of the battlefield. But my understanding is that the Ukrainians are now doing mopping up operations, that the Russians can't resupply those small teams of soldiers that have been infiltrated behind the Ukrainian lines. I agree with you. The Russians are going to try to do as much as they can to seize territory and give the impression that they're in control of territory. Because if the negotiations really begin, they're going to claim those small teams are in some village, let's say near Kupiansk or near Pokrovsk, and then they're going to claim Pokrovsk is theirs. Right? This is a Russian negotiating tactic. My own assessment is there's going to be no deal in Alaska. There really can't be because Zelensky's not going to be there. And so then the Russians are going to use this to buy a little bit more time. I think they have slowed down their airstrikes to some degree, probably because they're waiting for after the summit in Alaska, and then they're going to turn up the heat again on the Ukrainians and try to force the Ukrainians to surrender more territory. So they're just trying to improve their negotiating position. The Russians do this all the time. They go to the
Yes.
negotiating table while they continue strikes. Just ask the Syrian opposition, anyone that followed the events in Syria, the civil war in Syria, on what the Russians did there. So we can learn from that.
Yeah. No surprise.
No surprise. Yes.
So for negotiating positions, I think what we keep reading about is you've got Russia wanting terrain that they've taken, certain parts of terrain. They want some guarantees that Ukraine's not going to further mobilize, maybe even demobilize, depending on what you're reading. Obviously, a nod towards NATO and no membership for Ukraine there. How serious? How hard of those? How hard are those in terms of red lines for the Russians? Like some of these seem so unrealistic, but can they hold them? Are they just bargaining chips?
I think the Russians are taking a maximalist position, which is what they do. If they are forced to the negotiating table, and that requires us to demonstrate that we are willing to put more pressure on Moscow and cause more pain for Vladimir Putin and his regime, they will probably negotiate away some of those positions. They can compromise. Deals can be made, but it's never easy. And no one should assume that they're just going to show up and say, okay, we agree, we're going to remove our demand that Ukraine never be part of NATO. My understanding is they're still talking about this silly idea of denazification. If they wanted to do denazification, they'd have to denazify half of Russia. I think President Trump said recently when Putin offered to get involved in negotiations with the Iranians, focus on your own country and your own war. And that should be the message. They're talking about, my understanding is all the areas where they have occupied, like Donetsk, most of Luhansk, but they're in Zaporozhye, where they have not taken all of Zaporozhye. They're demanding that the Ukrainians cede all of Zaporozhye to Russia, and Kherson. What is ironic about all this is that those areas were never that is not Russian territory, and so. And the Ukrainians are saying, we're not going to do that. We're not going to surrender territory.
So the $1 million question, again, you're indicating that maybe not a lot of ground is made here, but there's an assessment that President Trump makes with Putin and then meets with Zelensky. But if you fast forward a few weeks or months, what do you think ends up happening in the end? And what's interesting is you and I had talked about this many months ago when we did the interview on Combat Story. You were very accurate in what you had assessed then. So I'm curious now, but what do you think this ends as?
Ryan, if I could only predict the stock market, that would be.
Yeah,
I'd be doing this podcast with you in
that's right. In a jet. Yeah,
a jet. That's right. We'd be on our yacht.
that's right.
I think President Trump is saying he wants an opportunity to meet with Putin face to face, hear Putin's response when he, says we want a ceasefire. That's one of the demands that the Ukrainians are making, and I think that the White House is making, and is a very reasonable demand. If you want to negotiate, stop attacking the Ukrainian positions, and the Ukrainians will stop attacking your positions. Right? I think the Ukrainians are probably ready to do that. The Russians have shown no willingness to do that. It goes back to my point about the Russians wanting to say they're negotiating, sending delegations to Geneva, Vienna, wherever, and then continuing to attack. The president, in my opinion, has every right as the leader of the United States to have this meeting Every other president has had their opportunity to engage Putin and Soviet leaders. This is called diplomacy. And as the head of state, we should support him and encourage him to do what's right here for the United States, which would be to support Ukraine and to make it clear to Vladimir Putin that if he does not make a deal, if he does not agree to some of the terms and show a willingness to compromise, then there will be serious consequences. And, you mentioned the deadline. President Trump, my understanding is we went forward on part of the deadline or the consequences, which are the secondary sanctions on India. Now the White House is saying, okay, be ready, including our European partners, be ready to enforce new sanctions, because it's not just going to be the United States alone. We all need to do this. And, if it were me, if I would make my position clear to Putin, if Putin doesn't agree to the position, I'd walk out of the meeting and say, okay, at midnight tonight, the secondary sanctions start. And until my Russian counterpart is ready to really negotiate in sincerity, there's nothing to talk about.
Do
That's
you
my
think
view.
in the end of this, whether it's a month down the road or more, Ukraine ends up losing ground?
I mean, listen. The Russians have been trying to take ground for 2 years. They've taken some ground, but especially in the last year, it's been very slow. Okay, they took ground, they lost ground. They're having a very hard time taking significant amounts of territory. They're paying a tremendous price for it. The Ukrainians have demonstrated that they can also take ground. And you never know with the Ukrainians. They may have a surprise up their sleeve, and they may launch another counteroffensive or offensive where they take back some ground. So on the battlefield, how things are going to work out, there are a lot of factors that go into what's going to happen long term. I do think, this is just my prediction, there will be serious negotiations in the next few months. There will be. It may take a meeting in Alaska where Putin is not willing to show that he's going to negotiate in sincerity, and then what has to come after that.
I do worry in the end Ukraine ends up losing some, which I would hate to see. I would hate to see it.
I guess a lot of people worry about that. The only thing I would say is, I said this to my Ukrainian friends many times. If we look at other examples, there have been examples where countries have temporarily had to give up control of parts of their country, and then they were able to take back that territory over time. If we look at like Germany after the Second World War, it was divided and split by the Soviet bloc. But eventually it's a unified Germany, thank God today. Germany is a unified country. There are other examples that we talk about Azerbaijan. The Azeris would have told you, 25% of their territory was taken away from them in the Nagorno-Karabakh war in the 90s. It's now part of Azerbaijan again today. So it may not be immediate that they get everything that they want back or that they deserve back, but over time they could get it back.
Yeah. That's an interesting take. Now, you travel to Ukraine a lot. We've talked about that. You spend time with people who are leading and making decisions over there. How would you advise them now? What are they thinking about going into this? I mean, they have been through years of bloodshed on this front.
How would I advise them? I don't know that I have any place to advise them. I always say the Ukrainians should be advising us. They have demonstrated to us a resilience and an ability to do things with very little, which is pretty incredible. I would just let them know that I think U.S. support is increasing. I saw a poll recently where support among, let's say, the MAGA population in the United States is increasing for Ukraine. I think the Ukrainians, I don't think I have to advise them. I think they're ready to make a deal. Like they're ready to show some willingness to compromise. But there are red lines for Ukraine, and my advice to them would be stick to those red lines. Like some of the things, like one of the things I understand that they agreed to, there was a summit with the Europeans this week where they said, we're never going to agree that Russia should allow us or tell us that we can be part of NATO or part of the European Union. I agree with that. That is not Russia's decision. That is the decision of Kiev, the Ukrainian people, right?
I agree with you. I feel like that would be a hard red line for Russia, though. Because as soon as Ukraine goes into NATO, the idea of ever setting foot in there again changes the entire calculus, does it not?
It may change the calculus, but let's take a step back. Why are we fighting that? Like, why are they fighting this war? What is it doing for Russia? It's not bringing Russia any benefit. And I tried to make this argument to Russians for years. Ukraine as an independent country is not a threat to Russia if you treat it well. It's actually could be a benefit for Russia. The
Completely
trade,
agree. Yes.
right? Now, you're right. Many people
Yeah.
in Russia don't agree with that. The level of paranoia is very deep, the level of concern, and we have to understand that too. I mean, we have to be realistic. I think this is one of the reasons why it's good President Trump is going to meet with Vladimir Putin. Let him hear directly from Putin and see what kind of is going on in Putin's head. Again, that's diplomacy. And I heard the Russian arguments over and over again. But at the end of the day, if the Ukrainian people vote for independence and the Ukrainian people vote to be part of the European Union, then that's their decision. We should never want any country to dictate to us. And my own
Agree.
view is the United States should stand by those countries that they're just trying to assert their sovereignty.
Kind of a philosophical question here. If I'm trying to put on my realist hat, would you not, as the US, want to back Ukraine and have them fight Russia and bleed Russia out on this? If you're the realist, to weaken Russia.
No,
No?
no. I mean, first of all, I don't know if I'm a realist or idealist. I guess on one issue I may be an idealist. I don't like a pessimist. On plenty of issues I'm pretty pessimistic. I am in Camp Ryan. I want to stress that. Okay, but I don't. The idea of bleeding Russia out. I don't think that's a good idea. Personally, I think I agree with the president. We need to end this war. I think if you actually the idea of bleeding Russia out is going to mean bleeding the Ukrainians out, and we can't do that. I mean, it's somebody said this once last year when there was a big debate about how much equipment and assistance we should give the Ukrainians, and we were kind of giving it drips and drabs, very slow to make decisions. And someone said, like, Washington is ready to fight to the last Ukrainian. I don't support that. I don't think that's fair to the Ukrainian people.
So let's say in the end here, Russia ends up with some Ukrainian territory. There's a land swap, as we've heard the term at this point. Do you worry, or should we worry, about how China might look at Taiwan if that were an outcome here? Or is that China taking a small piece of land from Taiwan is highly unlikely no matter what?
I would say, Ryan, that if the leadership of the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China sees that Putin gets everything he wants and doesn't pay a long-term price for what he did, this land grab, then there's a danger that they will try and grab
Interesting. Okay.
Taiwan. If they see that he doesn't get everything that he wants and that he's paid a serious price and he's had to suffer, then I think that their calculation will be different. I would also suggest that they, by the way, like talking about bleeding out, my guess is the Chinese are very happy to see the Russians expending a lot of resources and having to turn to Beijing and having to sell to Beijing at discounted prices, oil, gas, whatever the Chinese need. And I just want to do like a historic analogy going back to Alaska.
Yeah. Interesting.
Why did the Russians have to sell Alaska? They needed money to fight another war. Putin is now in a position where he's, I've argued this before, he's having to sell bits and pieces of Russia off to who? To Beijing.
Wow.
So that's not in the interest of the Russian people. It may be in the tactical interest of this regime. It's not in the long-term interest of the Russian people, and it's not in our long-term interest either, I would argue.
Super interesting. I mean, we talked about it before, like why Russia even did this. I mean, is there a good, if you're Putin, what has this earned him in the end? National pride, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I think what has earned Putin, that's a great question. I mean, let's try and put ourselves in the shoes or like in the seat of Putin and people around him. There was a legitimate paranoia and fear. I would argue they were not worried that Ukraine was going to invade, that thousands of Nazis were going to come across the border. I think what they were worried about was the ideological threat of Ukraine prospering while Russia was going backwards. And Russia was not developing economically. I remember dealing with Russians in 2017, 18 that were furious because the European Union was allowing Ukrainians to travel to Russia visa-free. To Europe visa-free. And the Russians couldn't do that. And they were furious, saying like, we're stuck. We can't go without a Schengen visa. And now the Ukrainians, who, let's face it, the Russians look down on them as the little brothers, are living better than we are. There are stories of when the Russian forces initially invaded Ukraine or expanded their invasion in 2022. Some of our Ukrainian friends, military friends, told us the story where they chased the Russians out of Kharkiv And the Russians had written all over the walls of apartments, and how dare you live like this? In other words, they had bathrooms, they had running water, they had washing machines in their apartments, and the Russians were furious because they don't have that. But the mentality is different than our mentality. Fortunately, we are Americans. We are part of the dream. We are a very prosperous country for all our faults. We're a great country. Many, many Russians deep down, they want that. And I think Putin and the people around him saw that if Ukraine continues to move closer to the West and integrate and develop, it's going to make people here say, why are we living with this guy telling us how to live? The Ukrainians are electing their president.
Yeah.
That's why they create this false narrative that it's like the government's illegitimate in Kiev. No, the Ukrainian people voted for President Zelensky. They voted him into office. They have a legislation, right? A legislator, legislation, what do you call it? The Rada.
Branch.
Like their parliament. Sorry. They elect their mayors. In Russia, those mayors are like put in place by the czar.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
I'm very confident. Many Russians are like, we're looking at Ukraine and saying, why can't we do that? Like, we're Slavic brothers. Putin says that all the time. We're Slavic brothers. The Ukrainians could do it. Why can't we? Well, when guys like Putin hear that, that's like, that's not good for me, right? Because I'll be the next Bashar al-Assad. Except where's he going to go? I mean, Assad went to Moscow. Where's Putin going to go? Pyongyang.
Yeah. So in short, I mean, it's for Putin to, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but like it serves him, doesn't really serve the rest of the country effectively.
Yeah. My personal opinion is serves the ego of one man and the the narrow interest of a small group of people. It is not serving Russia long term. It is not serving the interests of Russia. It's not serving Russian culture. What Putin did, Ryan, you go to Ukraine, and outside of one of the cities we visited, we stopped, and there's a monument to the Second World War, like what the Ukrainians call the Great Patriotic War, the Soviets call. And we were standing with two Ukrainian soldiers that we know, some officers, and I said to him, it's like Putin has turned Russia into the fascists. It's like they spit on the graves of all these people that fought to roll back like the fascist invasion, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. So I don't think long-term this is good for Russia.
Yeah.
And I tell you, there are a lot of Russians that are now ashamed to speak Russian in public. They don't want people I know in the United States 4 years ago, they were Russians. Now you talk to them, well, I'm Ukrainian. And no, I mean, it's sad. That's really sad. Nobody have to live like that. Putin and his regime has done that to the image of the country.
Interesting. Hey,
right?
I once saw a picture, and we'll cut this out if we can't have it in. Have you met Vitaly Klitschko?
Yes.
Are we allowed to talk about that? Like just the stature of this human? Like, is he as imposing as the mayor of Ukraine, of Kiev, for people who don't know, very famous boxer, giant. I mean,
yes.
Can his hand just palm your face?
Yeah, it's like, I mean, we wanted to take a selfie with him, and we said, can we ask, like, maybe your assistant to take a picture? He says, why? I have the best selfie stick in the world. And it's like, he reached across the room with his, and as we were talking to him, he's sitting there, and he's got, like, you could see these fists like this, and he's talking, and I'm saying to and then he's talking about his brother, his brother was also a world champion.
Also a boxer, right? Yeah.
And I said to one of the guys that was me, can you imagine if we had gone to war with these guys?
Like Ryan's on one leg, Glenn's on the other.
We'll take that trend. Well, about that. You see that guy's like hands? They're like baseball gloves. And what's he like? He's very, very smart. Very smart. Very thoughtful. Very, very smart, thoughtful. He's the mayor of the biggest city, the biggest municipality in Ukraine right now, and he's got a lot on his shoulders. His staff has a lot on his shoulders. I was very impressed with our meeting with him. I walked out of there. He said I'm not going to go into it here, but he said some very, very interesting things that were clearly thoughtful. He's not like a typical kind of just throw something out there politician looking for votes, or a very, very thoughtful guy. And some of the Ukrainians that we know told us, like, he's one of the only politicians other than Zelensky that has taken the time to go to the front, to visit the troops on the front.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Okay.
Even
that's
like
cool.
When they're in combat operations.
Okay.
On Christmas Eve or Christmas.
That's awesome. God, I love that.
Right.
Dude's like a world champion boxer, badass, giant, chiseled, And he still goes and does that when he could be on a yacht in the Mediterranean. So far from that. That's awesome. Okay, so now you know a thing or two about the espionage world. You've got Putin meeting with Trump. Putin, as well known, his background in KGB and the intel community. If you're advising Trump or the administration going into this meeting, what are you suggesting? Not just in the room, like President Trump knows how to handle that, but is there anything from your time working that Russian target that you would suggest going into this?
Well, the Russians are going to try and turn on a charm offensive. My understanding is he's bringing Lavrov, Belousov, the Minister of Defense. He's bringing Kirill Dmitriev, who's the guy that they kind of roll out with the Americans. He worked on Wall Street. He's very sharp, very sophisticated, right? They're going to try and turn on the charm offensive. There's supposed to be a lunch, I think, after the meeting. So my understanding is President Trump is going to meet President Putin with translators. That's it, right? And then, by the way, like for the people in the audience, the president shouldn't meet alone. Other presidents have done that, right? JFK did it with Khrushchev. Other people have done it. And there's nothing horrible about that.
And there's a note taker, is there not, Glenn, or no?
I think there'll be a note taker.
Usually, usually, yeah.
Right. I think, sometimes the principals don't want a distraction, right? They just want to focus on getting to know each other and talking to each other. So that's one. Two, to your question, and I'm sorry for digressing a little bit, but I think the Russians are going to try and turn on the charm. They're going to talk about all the benefits that they can give the United States, all the mineral rights deals that we can make, all the money that can be made, that they're the innocent ones here, that they didn't come up with this, they didn't start this war. They've been maligned in the Western media, which, the media, unfortunately, people are going to say the media in the United States has not carried itself very well in recent years on some issues. And now, like, Americans are a little bit doubtful sometimes, their faith in the media has dropped. And I'm sure the Russians are going to try and play on that. They're going to try and play that, with the president. And I'm not sure who the president's taking with him. My guess is Steve Witkoff. I don't know, maybe Marco Rubio, hopefully. I'm not sure who else. But they'll try and bamboozle. And they're very good at it, by the way. I'm not gonna lie. Like, when I met with the Russians, I enjoyed it. They're fun people to be around.
Wait, why? If they're very good at it, why do you enjoy that?
Well, because they're smart. They are, how do I say it? They're savvy in many ways. They have good sense of humor. So like it's not like they're going to be cretins. They're going to do the opposite. Now, the president and his team, my advice is be very, very careful, because a lot of that is a facade, right? It's a game.
They've got to know that, though, right, Glenn? They got to know that.
I hope so. I mean, the president of the United States is not he's not like right out of high school or college. He did business in New York for years. He must know what, complicated, tricky people are all about, and how people can turn on the charm, then stab you in the back as soon as you can. And I've written about this, but Putin wants to show the world that he's dominating President Trump, that he's in a position of strength, and that he's an equal at a minimum to Trump. I think President Trump needs to show Putin that ain't the case.
What about some of the critiques we'll hear that even having this meeting where Putin gets to be in proximity to Trump is a win for Putin?
Well, there may be some win for Putin, but with whom? Like, who's the win for? First of all, we in the U.S., the media, if that's the tack we take, we're just giving him a win, right? We, in a way, can control that if we control our initial instincts to say it's all bad. President Biden met with Putin in 2021 in Switzerland. They had a summit, even though Russian troops were occupying part of Ukraine, were killing Ukrainians. They had a summit. Every President Obama met with Putin. President Bush Jr. met with Putin. So I'm not against diplomacy. I'm not against trying to have some kind of dialogue. That is very important. Like, you can't resolve everything with war. I think we should have probably learned that in the last 30 years in this country. Not always the way. It's very important to have the most powerful military in the world and to be able to project power when you have to. But if you can resolve problems through negotiations, through dialogue, that's even better, right? And so going into this meeting, I think President Trump understands what he's dealing with. Maybe not the way that most people in Washington understand it. And I think this is what's challenging for a lot of people today. President Trump he's a different type of thinker. Marco Rubio said after they recognized, the Syrian government. I heard him testify to Congress, and he said, "Look, like we're taking a bit of a risk here. We're doing something. In the past, we'd have spent 2 years debating whether we should do this or not in Washington. We just made the decision to do it, move quickly, because we can't lose time. Because waiting 2 years will mean like Syria will be back into like a pit of vipers and terrorism and extremism, right? We're taking a risk. It may work, it may not work. We have to accept that. But sometimes you got to take a risk. So I applaud that personally."
And it sounds like not having Zelensky at the table for this meeting makes sense for several reasons. If it's just to really assess Putin and his willingness to come along, and if you're going to meet with Zelensky later, there's been a lot of heat about not having Zelensky at this particular meeting.
Yeah, and if you stick to the policy that we're not making any deal, this is not to discuss the future of Ukraine. This is to set up the next meeting and to find out whether Putin is even ready to do that. If Putin is not, then we go to plan B, which is not the best alternative, I think. Because when we talk about secondary sanctions, some of the things that I have advocated for, that's going to cause pain for our allies. It's going to cause some challenges in our relationships with others. We have to be realistic about that. Like, we don't operate in a vacuum. So if Putin can come out of the meeting and say, "Okay, I will order a cessation of all hostilities, and we're going to start negotiations," that would be a good thing, I think. Right now, it's not over yet, but it would be a good start. And the only way to do that is to have this meeting, I think, and for the president to sit face to face with Putin without a lot of distractions. And maybe you're right. I mean, I have mixed feelings about this. I kind of wish the president had invited Zelensky to Alaska and told President Putin, "This is my country. He's my guest." But I see what you're saying, and that makes sense too. Like, let them meet first, talk to each other, and then set the stage for a trilateral meeting. Or President Trump has said maybe some of our European partners there as well.
I'll get you out of here on this question, Glenn, but I mean, the Russians better than anyone I'll ever come across. What is it that you think would hit hardest to bring the Russians to the table, or just bring them in line a little bit more?
Well, I think that we've talked a little bit, and there are a lot of ideas on the table about ways to put more pressure on Moscow. One is secondary sanctions, increasing the sanctions. Two is increasing aid to the Ukrainians, supplying them with more.
Okay. Yeah.
And the White House has said that we will sell more equipment to the Europeans to support the Ukrainians. Maybe we change that position, give it directly to Ukrainians in the future as a sign that we're going right to them. So there are other things we could do too. I mean, you could go down the gamut of, responses. By the way, I think that we should, it's not just Ukraine, worldwide, wherever the Russians are causing havoc, we should support those people that are pushing back on. It's kind of the Ronald Reagan approach.
What's an example of that, Glenn? Sorry, is that Africa you're thinking?
Maybe Africa, Latin America, the Western Hemisphere. Like some of their allies there, maybe they should feel a little bit of heat.
Interesting.
Right? But one thing too, Ryan, which it's not a very popular thing to say with many people in the United States today, so I hope we don't get any death threats on restricted handling, but we also have to think, we're talking about the stick. What is the carrot? What is the incentive? How do we incentivize the Russians to behave better? There's one thing I've said for years, we're not very good at it. Starting in 2014, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have sanctioned the Russians. We should have for what they did. But we also need to think, when they do something that is tangible and is positive, how do we respond to that? How do we show them that, that is not we see that as a good thing and it's in our national interest. And so what do we do there? This is going to be very, very tricky, because the Russians obviously want us to remove all the sanctions and let their economy thrive again. The Ukrainians are very worried that that's going to happen, and the Russians are going to use that to then rearm their military, start a new offensive in 5 years, 2 years, 10 years, you name it. You asked before, how does this all end? If you ask many Ukrainians, they say that it's been going on for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Does it ever end? I don't know. I mean, that's the kind of pessimist in me. But we do need to think about what are the incentives, the tangible things that Russia could do. For example, withdrawing from Ukrainian territory, right?
Big.
Big. How would we respond? Right? And then we have to think about the long-term impact on both Ukraine and Russia, and that means the entire world, of all of the destruction and all of the, let's say, PTSD issues that we're going to be facing, societal disruption in both countries where hundreds of thousands of citizens have been at war, where children, especially on the Ukrainian side, this is a heartbreaker. Children have been subjected to the horrors of war in a way that no child should ever be subjected to.
Yeah.
How are we in the United States and the West, the rest of the world, going to respond? The war in Ukraine, let's say that there's a ceasefire tomorrow, our work just begins, I think.
Yeah. Interesting.
And with Russia, we need to think about how do we incentivize the Russians. So there has to be some kind of carrot.
This is great. Glenn, anything we missed or that talking points that you think we need to land with folks?
No, but I want to go back to our first encounter together on the show back when, I don't know, 2023, or when I was with you with Gavin.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. In your studio, which is a great day. By the way, Ryan has really good beer. Anybody? That's why I was a little drunk at the
I might
end.
be having some right now, possibly.
Cheers. Budmo, we say in Ukrainian.
What is it? Wutmo? What is it?
Budmo.
Budmo. All right.
But I do want to say you're like a Russia expert. I'm not a Russia expert. Nobody is a Russia expert, in my opinion. So for all your listeners, if someone tells you that they really understand Russia, be very careful, because it's very, 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 even Russians don't understand their country, in my opinion. So I see a lot of people out there promoting themselves as Russia experts. I want to stress that I am not really. I mean, I'm a Long Island expert. I understand Long Island.
Give me a break. All right.
But I don't understand Long Island.
Hey, but Glenn, for those who aren't watching, your haircut is looking good. It's sharp.
Thank you.
You're going to be on TV this weekend. I don't know if we could talk about it, but
let's not talk about you.
All right. But you're looking good.
You're looking good.
Yeah.
You look marvelous.
All right. Until next time, everybody, thank you for tuning in. And if you're interested in getting a daily take, a little daily intel brief on what's going on in Russia, China, Iran, Middle East, some other places, we've got something curated with just open source. You can go to restrictedhandling.com and sign up, and you'll get that in your inbox every Monday to Friday in the morning.
Highly recommended. Really great thing that Ryan put together. So,
yeah.
Outstanding work.
All right. Thanks so much.